Myth is a fundamental part of what binds and propels a nation forwards towards a shared goal. And in the case of Israel and the surrounding Arab states following the end of the British Mandate in 1948, the mythology of David versus Goliath certainly played to the Israelis' advantage in mustering national solidarity against the armies of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. In the Six-Day War in 1967, however, what may have appeared to be a superior force, at least numerically, on the Arab side, quickly turned into a rout as the Israelis swiftly destroyed their opponents' armies. In Egypt in particular, the Arab nationalist leader Gamal Nasser suffered a major blow to his prestige as a military commander, and his myth as a greater Arab leader was never able to recover.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
Ich bin ein Tier.
На полный разгон гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. I'm Hank Oslo, and I'm joined here today by Nick Mason.
Hey.
Adam Smith.
Hey everyone.
And Hans Lander.
Hi guys.
And today we're going to be talking about the Six-Day War between Israel and essentially everyone, June 5th to June 10th of 1967. And if you're wondering who wins, the name of the war should maybe give you a clue. Before I start, do we have any donations or public relations that we want to get into?
Yeah, actually, I mentioned in our previous show on the NSA that we're having some issues with the Patreon. Those issues are now cleared up. I do not have on hand, though, recent donations.
All right. That sounds
also,
good.
Alex is still missing for those who are still asking. That hasn't changed.
Yeah, we know nothing. We actually don't know anything. We're being coy. We haven't heard anything from anyone about anything. So, the Six-Day War, the kind of canonical book about this is written by a Israeli-American Jew, or an American-Israeli Jew, Michael Oren. He himself is kind of an interesting figure. There's not a small chance that he might end up being Prime Minister of Israel at some point in the future. But he was born in America and sort of, from his teens ended up being a very overseas Israeli sort of operator. He ended up moving to Israel and doing a lot of public relations for them. At one point, he was their ambassador to the United States, which, given the sort of power dynamic there, is a very important position in the Israeli cabinet, or basically the kind of the goy wrangler for the entire country. He also is their current deputy prime minister, and still ends up doing a lot of kind of PR. He's on NPR with fair amount of regularity, and of course he's very much a apologist for the Israeli regime, particularly their actions in Gaza and the West Bank. So some of the things in his book you end up having to take with a grain of salt, particularly when he starts talking about things like the USS Liberty, which will be the topic of next week's show. But the book itself is a very detailed and actually fairly even-handed look at the actual conflict itself. So I would recommend this book. Maybe avoid paying for it, but it's probably worth a read if you find this sort of thing interesting. So what was going on in 1967, like around this time. Like Israel was founded about 20 years prior. They had fought a series of wars of kind of varying levels of actual jeopardy with their neighbors. 56 Suez Crisis, kind of notably. They're surrounded by these two Arab nationalist regimes, kind of an unstable non-entity Lebanon and the Kingdom of Jordan. And there's a lot of tension with their neighbors, particularly Syria and Egypt. There's a lot of kind of cross-border exchanges of artillery. There are raids coming from the West Bank of Jordan and from the Golan Heights, where you have Palestinians, coming in. They shoot up the place. They kind of ride out. They lay landmines. They lay explosives. So tensions are sort of high, and they're exacerbated by the fact that these Arab nationalist regimes in Egypt and Syria sort of play up the conflict as a way of legitimizing their own regime. That they're, the only ones who can fight these Israeli usurper bastards, and someday soon we're going to really give them the business. Any day now. And things sort of come to a head in 1967, where previously, there had been full-on, like, multi-thousand-person raids by Israel into the West Bank. There had been a string of artillery strikes on Israeli positions in northern Israel from the Golan Heights. And the USSR, for some reason that still has not really been divulged, falsely reports that Israel is massing troops on their southern border, probably in preparations to invade the Sinai Peninsula.
There's a non-trivial or accidental reason that has been put forward as to why that happened. For whatever period this was in sort of the overall Soviet strategy in the Cold War, what I mean by that is basically the various allies of the United States and USSR, respectively, were shifting a lot, especially in the Middle East. For whatever reason, they had, at the time, decided that the Arabs were going to be their ally in the Soviet Union. And so the report that was put out was thought to then lend support for the idea that if Egypt, for example, has the backing of the Soviet Union, that's a good thing. And it was sort of viewed as like propaganda for other nations to come under the fold of the USSR. So in other words, if there's a war and all these very nice pieces of Soviet equipment perform well, that's a PR coup for the USSR.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird the extent to which the Arab-Israeli conflicts in kind of the 1960 to present day end up being used as just giant advertisements for various forms of military hardware. Like, people talking up like, look what Israel did with these F-16s. Like, don't you want some, Pakistan? Like, wouldn't you like to buy a few S-400 SAM systems that are doing so well in Syria?
Look at what Saudi Arabia just did to that Yemeni village. I mean, it's pretty disgusting, actually. But it's the world we live in.
Right. So, sort of taking this, that false report happened on May 13th, and things sort of escalate from there. Egypt decides, based on this, and kind of based also on just, a generic desire to escalate the conflict, because everybody likes a, kind of a dashing general figure. So if you're Nasser in this situation, playing things up a little bit, at least making it look like there's a crisis. Maybe not going to war, but, you stir the pot a little bit, can really only help you. So there's a small peacekeeping force, mostly of Indian dot not feather troops on the Sinai Peninsula, which is demilitarized. Egypt tells them to take a hike. and starts sending a bunch of troops into the Sinai Peninsula, which brings them into the sort of border area of Israel. And things are sort of like not necessarily in crisis stage at this point. Like, you know, everybody is sort of saber rattling, and it's also pretty clear that, you know, their armed forces are really not objectively the best. They're primarily made of conscripts who don't really want to be there. They're not that smart. Like, they're a lot of illiterate troops. Their officers are all there because they're political allies of the regime rather than being particularly competent. Have no real idea of how to use a lot of the fancy equipment been provided with by the USSR. So when you look at things like the US CIA assessments from the time, they're like, well, you know, we shouldn't really get too worried about this because worst case scenario, even if they end up just, you know, driving straight north, as soon as they get there, probably it'll be over in like 10 days with a pretty crushing Israeli victory. So nobody's really quite concerned at this point, but it's definitely an escalation.
Well, do you want to explain the fact that they were in the Sinai, basically, and putting troops at the port there was significant to Israel because that was their Israel is a very kind of narrow country, obviously, but the southernmost point of it is basically on that little part of the water to the east of Sinai that gets you eventually to the Indian Ocean. And that was their passage to eastern trading routes that was strategically important, obviously, to Israel, which otherwise is cut off to the Mediterranean. So that was viewed as an act of war. I mean, blockading a country is traditionally viewed that way. So that was why there was a lot of concern.
Yeah, after the initial troop deployment, they started putting soldiers on kind of the heights overlooking the Straits of Tiran. That's Tiran, not Tehran, the capital of Iran. But they started putting troops there, and 10 days later, they actually did close the straits. They sent some gunboats. It wasn't terribly dramatic, I guess, but they declared that it was closed to shipping, that they had mined it, which was false, and that no Israeli-flagged ships or strategic supplies would be allowed to flow through there. And this is the point where things sort of really start to head towards war. Israel is getting about 90% of their oil from the country of Iran, which was still ruled by the Shah, through that port. Cutting it off had some sort of operational implications, given that, like, you know, you need oil to fight a war. So they start basically fishing for a excuse to sort of lead this into a full-on shooting war. And when I say excuse, at the time they didn't seem to believe that this was like a sort of a do-or-die provocation. This isn't like, you know, the U.S. embargoing Japan's oil in 41. It was more of an annoyance, honestly, particularly because Lyndon B. Johnson had guaranteed to them that if nothing else, they would be able to get oil from the U.S. to their main port of Haifa on the Mediterranean. So there was no real case that they were going to be kind of starved into submission or something dramatic like that. But what it does indicate was that, like, the Arabs wanted to escalate, and the Israelis were also happy to have a war. Despite the fact that pretty much everybody agreed that Israel was going to win whatever conflict ended up happening.
I have a couple questions about that. Before I do, I was able to look up on the blockchain. There actually was a donation in Bitcoin, which I wanted to quickly thank the wallet 1HRZ. Thank you very much. But my questions were, and I think you kind of alluded to this with the Arab states, but what was the motivations for, at least with Egypt, we're sending troops to the Sinai? And then also, what is Israel's reasoning for wanting to fight a war? I assume it's because they would win or something, but...
Yeah, I mean, Israel is much more straightforward. Like, you know, we were talking before the show, and some people thought this analogy was maybe a little bit playing too much to our modal audience, but I'll roll with it anyway. So there's this game, Europa Universalis, that I'm pretty sure that at least 20% of our listeners play, and there's this game mechanic where like you can't just like go to war. You have to wait for somebody to like randomly pick a fight, or you like go through some machinations to pick a fight. You go and you insult some other country. You say your country is dumb, your daughter's ugly, like, or some random member of their court, like he steals a horse from some visiting noble, and you take these things very seriously because like you want to kick the snot out of them. So you choose to take provocation because you're in a position to advance your own position, and so you run with it even though you could shrug off the provocation without real consequence. And that's what the Israelis were doing. Like they wanted to put themselves into a better position. They wanted to demonstrate that they could knock the crap out of these surrounding armies. They wanted to destroy a bunch of hardware, solicit some help from the superpower, and solidify their own position. Basically, they were in a position where they were happy to win a war. The real question is like, okay, well, if you're Egypt, why are you happy to lose a war? And the go ahead.
Well, who says that they wanted a war?
I think that's so. It's pretty clear. There's a internal.
Nick, why did they send soldiers to that port and blockade the straits? I mean, that's provocative.
Yeah, I mean the line on the Sinai though is defensive in its orientation, and that's widely
agreed. There's no such thing as a fort is like defensive and offensive because it's a place that you can't be out of, that you can strike from. Like there's no real clean distinction there. Like so there was a release on I don't know like the primary sourcing of this, but every secondary source that I've read agrees there was a planned attack on May 27th by Egypt and its allies, and somehow Israeli intelligence got a hold of this plan. Mm-hmm. They send a cable to their ambassador to the U.S., who basically freaks out and demands of LBJ that you need to send us oil, you need to send us guns, like, we're freaking out here, oy vey, you have to guarantee our security. LBJ basically tells them to take a hike.
They sent the head of Mossad there, and then there may have been multiple envoys that were going back and forth, but yeah, basically it's the McNamara and LBJ were like, no, we've got enough to handle with Vietnam, sorry, we're not getting involved.
Yeah.
And
they are complicit, but we'll get into that next week. More clandestinely complicit.
Sure.
Let's talk about the Egyptian side.
Well, I have to say something too, because the Egyptians were talking to the Soviets, and the Soviets basically told them, we can't back you unless you're attacked first. And the obvious sort of implication there is that they were considering attacking first.
Right.
So,
and then this is all like pretty confirmed. So they, like, their ambassador like brings this to the U.S. LBJ says, well, we don't believe you. A. B. Like, everybody seems to agree you'll kick the crap out of these guys if they do attack you. So, like, unless the Russians get involved, we don't really care. Like, have fun with your war or whatever. But
yeah, and the Zionists were whining about being, as they do in their revisionism on the topic after the fact. And it's the myth of Israel, and particularly in the minds of Christian Zionists and boomer Republican types, is that there's this underdog, this our greatest allied democracy underdog in the Middle East, and it was besieged by all these Arab savages, and they fought a defensive war. When, yes, this, even the, let's see, it was Helms, I have a quote from, Helms had the Office of National Estimates prepare an appraisal of the Mossad assessment that you mentioned was brought to them. And this was from the CIA. So we do not believe that the Israeli claim of being the, quote, underdog, and it was a serious estimate of the sort they would not submit to their own high officials.
Yeah. In other words, like, okay, so they sent like a propaganda thing of like the worst case estimate of the worst case estimate, which does seem to be what happened. But nonetheless, like, so LBJ calls the USSR and says, if you're assisting in an attack by proxies that would lead to some sort of ill-defined crisis between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So the Soviets then take this and this, giant game of telephone to Nasser. Nasser realizes, okay, well, we no longer have the element of surprise. So, like, there's a difference between losing and getting annihilated. Probably we want to call this off. So he calls it off. And things are sort of in stasis as the Israelis stew and plan what they're going to do. They eventually decide, like 2 days later, that, okay, it's time for us to go to war.
Well, and you had, Hank, also, just on this, whether the Egyptians wanted war. I mean, I have some more from the source material that you're working off of. What is it, Michael Oren? Is that right?
Yep, that's him.
Yeah, so he, in that book, he says, by all reports, Israel received from the Americans, and according to its own intelligence, Nasser had no interest in bloodshed. And then you have also the famous quote from Menchem Begin. He said in an 82 speech, in June of 1967, we had a choice. The Egyptian army concentrations in the Sinai approaches do not prove that Nasser was really about to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him. And then you have Yitzhak Rabin, who was the head of the IDF at the time. He later became prime minister of the Zionist entity. He said, I do not think Nasser wanted war. The 2 divisions which he had sent to the Sinai on May 14th would have not been sufficient to start an offensive war against Israel. He knew it and we knew it.
Yeah, so when I say they wanted a war, I mean, like, so the optimal outcome for Nasser is like, okay, so I send my troops to the border, we stomp around, I look like a big man, and everybody's happy, and then we use that as like a further strategic position to put pressure on Israel. So like you would see things like what actually ended up happening after the war, where you have these kind of wars of attrition where you're like increasing the cross-border raids. Every so often you lob some artillery across the border. You're fortifying your positions so you're more difficult to dislodge. Like that would be an optimal outcome from his perspective. But like it had been conveyed repeatedly that like Israel would consider closing the Straits of Tiran as some sort of a casus belli or a justification for war. Like Nasser knew that he was like what he was doing was like plausibly going to lead to war. Like it could not have come as a shock.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, and it gives the motivation for what Israel wanted.
I also don't believe the narrative of like, Israel is this like, this island of democracy and a sea of tyranny.
Yeah, of course you don't. You wouldn't be allowed to believe this and participate. But no, Hank, I mean, I'm not trying to contradict you so much as I'd like to address the general myth that is, you see pop up in the American political scene, which is that, they fought this, defensive war as a preemptive defensive war, which, figure that one out.
Which, so that gets pretty funny. So 27 May, the Egyptian attack is canceled. The Israelis are like furiously trying to figure out what they're going to do. Eventually, on June 1st, they form a, quote, national unity government. Basically, they form a war cabinet. And they recall I don't know how to pronounce the Yiddish name. Is it Moshe?
Moshe.
Moshe. So they recall Moshe Dayan, who look up a picture of the guy. He's a charismatic guy. He's a very interesting guy. He's got a pretty badass eye patch.
He'll be coming up a lot next week.
Yes, he was at the time literally in Vietnam, embedded with the U.S. Marine advisors there, seeing how to wage a modern conflict. So he's not actually involved with any of the kind of immediate planning, but he had previously been the Israeli chief of staff. He had been instrumental in the 56 war. He had fought to the 48. Israel is a small country. Like, it's a legitimately small country. So, like, there's these people that end up popping up.
Yeah, at the time it was like, what, 2 million people? I mean,
yeah, and like,
small.
if you kind of discard, like, recent immigrants, it's like, it's kind of like the colonial U.S., where, like, if you look down the laundry list of, like, people who signed the Declaration of Independence, there's no, like, non-entities there. It's like everybody there is pretty impressive and goes on to do some interesting things. Like, they kind of, quote-unquote Israeli founding fathers are kind of also similarly interesting. And that, like, half of the division commanders in 67 end up going on to be prime minister, minister of defense, or chief of staff, or whatever. But anyway, so they recall him because, especially after this conflict, he ends up being a combination of, like, I don't know, like Douglas MacArthur, Patton, and Eisenhower, this almost larger-than-life figure. But at the time, he was kind of their, like, consensus, like, okay, like, who's our best guy? So they get him out of Nam, they put him on a fast plane back to Tel Aviv, and 3 days later they decide, quote-unquote, they officially decide, okay, tomorrow, let's go to war.
Not to be cruel, but who was that guy in the Goonies who was like, hey, you guys? Didn't he have an eye patch, too?
I don't know that I've ever seen that movie.
You've never seen the Goonies?
Goonies, hey, you guys.
Yeah.
Let me see. Okay, well, Moshe Dayan looks a little bit better than this guy. I don't think he has an eye patch so much as a deformity.
He's got. I think he was like probably burned inside of a tank. I don't know what it's something to do with his skin, and it looked like he lost his hair too. Not to take away from what you're saying, I just had that image of him in my mind from researching this, and it just popped in there. So
yeah. So basically, the actual war of the 6-Day War is the least interesting part of this. I don't know, it has implications, but the progress itself is kind of dominated by the fact that, well, the first thing you do in a defensive war is you have a series of airstrikes that basically kills 100% of your opponent's air force on the ground. So Operation Focus launches in the early morning of June 5th, which is a series of sorties. The Israeli Air Force at this time is mostly using French jets, where they have some interesting kind of tactical approaches that they're kind of clearly beta testing for the U.S., where they strike all of the Egyptian runways. Very effective sort of rocket bombs, where you drop the bomb, a rocket engine engages at a certain height, and it basically pile drives under the runway. It blows up, and it leaves a nice little crater. So you can't drive an airplane over that because it'll break its landing gear. Planes can't take off. Planes can't land. Everything's now stuck on the ground. Wave 2 comes in and blows away all of the jets that are neatly parked alongside these desert airfields with no hardened bunkers whatsoever. They're flying well under radar, so none of the fancy Russian SAM equipment even picks them up. And they don't have adequate actual like a flak anti-aircraft, like a cannon-based anti-aircraft to attack low-flying targets. So everything is wiped out. Egypt loses almost 100% of its air force, and they have 0% sort of combat efficiency. So at this point, Israel has not just air superiority, but air supremacy, where nothing is in the air that doesn't have a Star of David behind it.
Let's, before we get into the nitty-gritties on how that war plays out, I just wanted to address again this whole idea of the Jew wages a defensive war as he blows up your planes that are on the ground. For instance, Bret Stephens from the New York Times, he wrote, on June 5th, the first day of the war, the Israeli government used 3 separate diplomatic channels to warn Jordan, then occupying the West Bank, not to initiate hostilities. The Jordanians ignored the warnings and opened fire with planes and artillery. So here he is implying that Jordan fired the first shot of the war when...
they were drug in later. So this is where
the
it
New York
gets
Times,
really,
though, dude. Like,
so,
this is what they would have people believe. It's very important to them
that's
to
what we
frame
would
it
the
that
actual
way.
truth, like, it's so bizarre. So not only are like the Israelis like really doing everything right, like textbook correct at this point, but the Egyptians had literally shut off their air defenses midway through this because they have a plane in the air that's carrying one of their generals to the Sinai to command their troops. Like, it's like, okay, dude, like get in like a Mercedes. That seems almost as fast as a jet. Like if you're trying to get across this not terribly large flat desert.
I mean, this gets to the larger issue of just Arabs are just, there's something wrong with them. I mean, I don't know like how their culture really works, but it seems to be akin to there's like a guy who's ostensibly in charge who got there by basically blowing away like all the other people in front of him. So everybody's terrified of falling out of line. You sort of saw this in Iraq and other sort of places. And I can't generalize completely, but there seems to be a lot of these countries that operate this way. And they just don't have the ability to seem to be operating other than exactly what they're told to do. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of delegation to just common sense to the troops on the front line.
I wouldn't just, there's definitely some truth there, but I would add, I think Nasser, for instance, was a great man, and I would smart him.
So, like, there's definitely a smart fraction, but when you're fighting a war with 85 IQ conscripts who are led by political generals whose virtue is their, like, political non-threateningness rather than competency, you're trying to, like, do a very complicated, like, network of anti-air defenses and, like, covering the advance of your soldiers as you, like, fight a very well-equipped, modern, very intelligent, very well-led army. Like, you're just going to get smashed, absent some very special circumstances. So they... Especially, so when you talk about not having air power, it's like, okay, well, you know, the U.S. has fought all of these wars for the past, like, 30 years. We've had, you know, massive air supremacy. It's not like Al-Qaeda has an air force, and we keep sort of getting our asses handed to us, so it can't matter that much. But the thing is, when you're pinned down because somebody is dropping bombs on you, it's very difficult for you to move around. So it's very difficult for you to maneuver. It's difficult for you to get your logistics in order, your supply chain up to the front. You start to run out of stuff. Your communications start to go down because your radio guy got and your wires got cut because somebody dropped a bomb. And
morale goes down. Battalion morale goes down. Your ability to command people to do things goes down. Risk of shell shock. Suddenly you find yourself in a situation where people are confused, potentially have their eardrums blown out, and it's difficult to, I mean, even if you have a strong NCO structure, which the Israelis kind of did, you can't do anything. You guys are completely without ability to hear you or function sometimes, and you have all the knock-on effects that Hank is talking about. I mean, if the Army's logistics chain breaks down, that's it. There's no, they don't have a real opportunity to survive at that point.
Yeah, well, they didn't even really get to the point where logistics, quote unquote, matter, because as soon as they get done killing the Air Force, they start bombing the actual frontline troops, and the Israelis start advancing into the Sinai.
When they went after the thousands of tanks that Egypt had, which was actually on paper much more formidable than the Israeli equivalent, which was 3 times smaller in quantity at least, they ended up killing 15,000 people. And the Israelis only lost 300 from that.
You know, this gets into a larger point that I'd like to bring up at some point about combined arms operations. But part of the training for combined arms operations is just learning how to survive against them, how to survive against a multi-pronged approach coming from multiple force multipliers. If you're not trained in how to survive or think quickly or even just get out of there or try and use a tactical retreat, you're going to lose thousands and thousands of men rapidly.
I think that's a good point. I think training, and I've certainly done this in my earlier years, training is very often underestimated by people. I think a lot of
extremely underestimated.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who come into money, I mean, especially like oil states, they end up buying all this military equipment that is shiny and looks impressive, on the videotapes that Lockheed shows you. But then you're like given this jet, and you've got an airfield, and you really don't know what you're doing. I mean, and this is what basically the U.S. military and most militaries engage in all day or all year, is they're basically on drills, and they're going through war games constantly because you don't know exactly the circumstances you're going to find yourself in. You don't know exactly what force the enemy is going to be comprised of. So you really have to have a lot of scenarios that you've been trained in. And what they say is that basically, when you're in the thick of battle, you don't have a lot of time to think, and that's when your training kicks in. It's basically a muscle memory instinct that you've sort of taught yourself, and I think that's why training is so important. That probably is underestimated by a lot of people who come into things quickly, and I would say that's kind of like the oil states.
And the Arabs have never undergone a lot of military selection pressures, right? So Arabs have not had 13 to 1400 years of mixed combat the way that Europeans or Chinese have had. We're never exposed to gunpowder until much later. We're never exposed to cannons. The one time the Arabs came across horse archers with Mamelukes, they got wiped out. They got wiped out by an infinitesimally smaller force. It was just had a slightly better tactic than they did.
Man, that's some Alex posting right there.
No, and it literally is. I mean,
no, I'm not disagreeing.
Europeans and Chinese, and even Mongols had more experience in dealing with mixed combat arms operations and enduring against them than Arabs ever did. Like, by the time Arabs actually went face to face with someone using cannons, they were fighting Napoleon. And Napoleon, basically stomped through Egypt in a day. It was a mix of cavalry, infantry, and cannons from the sea, and it completely destroyed the Mamelukes, the last Mamelukes who had conquered the Arabs in Egypt.
Well, while we're talking
the Israelis are.
Well, go ahead. Sorry, Hank. While we're talking about the Arabs, I wanted to get in a little bit into the relations between the Arab states, between the UAR, which was Egypt at the time, the United Arab Republic, and Syria and Jordan, as well as the presence of the UN, was Expeditionary Force? It was the UNEF, but
peacekeeping, the
emergency force.
I want to hear Hank's point on Israel first, though.
Sure.
Yeah, so if you're looking at comparative army effectiveness, the other thing is that, Israel has a pretty small kind of professional, small and well-equipped, well-trained, regular army. But when they've kind of gone to war, the vast majority of their forces actually end up being reserves. Mm-hmm. And the thing about these units is, so a regular army, it's very easy, well, not very easy, you have to put effort into it, but it is possible to develop a really good sort of esprit de corps, pride in your ability to work with each other loyalty to each other, willingness to stick your neck out to protect your other soldiers, as opposed to just, fuck this, I'm going home. That conscript armies from all over the country put in these intentionally dispersed units don't have. And then
willingness to keep your mouth shut after your fellow comrade in arms slaughters a Palestinian family in front of you.
Yeah, that too. I mean, doesn't hurt. And it's also when you have reserves that are comprised of units that are all from the same kibbutz or from the same religious community, that also has a very good effect on cohesiveness. And pretty much everybody was sort of aware that, okay, if we, we're probably not going to lose this war, but, you're fighting for the existence of your country, as opposed to, again, 85 IQ peasant drafted, and, I'm here for what? These guys don't seem great, but I don't know if I'm willing to get shot in order to drive Israel into the sea. Maybe I'd rather...
And not to compare the Zionists to... I mean, this is an ancient principle in warfare. I mean, you had the sacred band of Thebes, and that was... they defeated Sparta along those lines. I mean, it does makes you much stronger when you have cohesiveness amongst the soldiers.
I mean, the flip side of that argument, though, is that same band of Thebes was not only wiped out, but their entire city erased, a couple of centuries later by Alexander. I mean, that's not all it is. If you have good cohesiveness, that's pretty clear. There's the infamous article, Why Arabs Lose Wars, cites that in particular.
Who is that, Hans?
Why Arabs Lose Wars.
Yeah, who read that?
Norval Atkine.
Okay, I've heard of it. I've never read this. I've heard of this.
So one of the contentions he makes is that essentially Arab generals, and this is pre 9/11 analysis of Arab militaries, but essentially one of the reasons why Arab armies do so particularly poorly is that their generals treat them as, quote, treat their soldiers as subhumans. They basically don't see them as having any real value, and maybe they're not too wrong. If you don't instill your troops with value, they don't have value. You can't utilize them effectively. That they would probably be better off as human capital, working their fields or shepherding somewhere in the heartland rather than going off and fighting this war, because if you don't equip them with anything, if you just give them some guns the Americans sold you and some really terrible boots and they get 30 blisters a day, they're not useful to you.
I mean, this is this whole, second generation versus third generation warfare. I doubt it's even that complicated in the case of the Arab armies, but it's the main contrast between the second and the third is that you have a centralized, top-down, tell your troops exactly what to do, follow the chain of command, versus the third generation, which is more of apparently the Wehrmacht operated this way. They were managing by objective, and so they would delegate the task to the lower level unit, which would then further delegate to the lower levels. But basically it was giving a lot of freedom for the officers and the individual soldiers to make decisions. And if you take out that aspect and you take out the fact that they weren't even trained properly, following orders when it calls for actually changing what you're doing because the circumstances literally just got blown up on the airfields back behind your lines, you're going to have huge problems. They can't adjust, they can't adapt, and there's a lot of face saving going on too when you have this very top-down control system where people don't want to acknowledge that they maybe were incorrect or they need to adjust their strategy, and so you have people continuing on these ridiculous prior decisions that no longer are valid. So it's just a very poor way to fight, in my opinion.
Well, they don't have a good NCO structure. That's part of it. So you mentioned the Wehrmacht. I mean, most Western militaries operate this way. It's a lot of different points of view have gone into this. Everyone from von Clausewitz to various strategists.
Well, William S. Lind was kind of the big contrast.
What's not a coincidence when you talk about people like the Clausewitz and talk about the Wehrmacht and talk about the Waffen SS is there was actually and this is something we're going to talk about later this month with our friend Mencken from Rebel Yell, there was a real knowledge being imparted by former SS to
like Otto Skorzeny.
Otto Skorzeny, yes.
Yeah,
and there were other advisors and trainers.
Generally, it's that point. Generally, the Israelis have a Western military structure, and part of a modern Western, not even a totally modern, but especially in the modern era Western military structure, you have non-commissioned officers. You essentially train your officers, you train your battalions well enough to operate self-sufficiently if lines of communication are cut. This, in theory, it's been said it goes all the way back to Roman military tactics. To what extent that's true, it's not totally clear how that would have worked with the Roman structure. But what is apparent is that, particularly through the late Middle Ages, with the development of independent nightly groups into Teutonic Order, which had clear separation of units and regional commanders and several chains of command that were self-sufficient. Especially in the modern era, when you become reliant on lines of communication, if they get cut, you need to be able to operate effectively. Even the Soviets managed to figure this out. Even Soviet NCOs or Soviet officers that weren't just sort of dumb apparatchiks from Moscow figured out how to operate independently if they needed to.
I misspoke there, right? Because in my mind the threads were connected. You said Clausewitz. I was actually thinking of the Israeli military historian Martin Van Creveld.
Oh no! I was saying but it all does link. I mean,
well, it all does link because Clausewitz was, I guess, what you would call second generation warfare.
Yeah, I mean, Clausewitz was sort of on that cusp of the third generation,
right?
Coming up with a lot of the structure that would become third generation warfare.
The third generation warfare, I guess, is maneuver warfare. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Self-sufficiency.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
it's overlapping realms of self-sufficiency. Essentially, the whole army can be self-sufficient, or certain units within the army can be self-sufficient. The army can act independently of whatever the president says, essentially, which is a big departure from the Middle Ages, which is the army is either doing what its dukes tell it or what the king is telling it.
So, you want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the Arab states? Hank?
Yeah. So this is the funniest part of the war, in my opinion. So Israel has destroyed at this point the entire Egyptian Air Force. They have destroyed a lot of the frontline positions. They're pile driving through the Sinai. Basically, the Egyptians are running backwards as quickly as they can. They're abandoning equipment. The response of Nasser is to call up Syria and Jordan and say, fantastic news. We've repelled the Israeli airstrikes. Our troops are advancing through their positions. We estimate that we'll be outside of Tel Aviv in 2 days. You guys need to join in right now.
Good thing that Jordanians don't have spy satellites. But yeah,
that was him attempting to get them roped in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I should add something that, for context, again, back to the mainstream propaganda narrative that they preemptively launched a defensive war. But part of that, one of the things that they like to point to was Nasser's ordering the evacuation of the UNEF, that I mentioned earlier, the UN Emergency Force. And that was seen as, or at least in retrospect by the usual suspects, that's taken as evidence of Egypt's warlike intentions. And the part of that background that's not given is the context of him doing that in relationship to the other Arab states. And the issue here was that, if you conceptualize the UNEF as sort of this, just as they would have it, as a peacekeeping force, blah, blah, blah. Well, reality was that it was there after, in particular, you had a incident in it goes all the way back to 48 because the UNEF was actually formed if I remember correctly, I have this. It was formed in 56 following the Suez incident, which we will get into next week. But there was very bad blood between the Arab states because Syria and Jordan were sort of butthurt that Egypt did nothing to come to Jordan's assistance in 66, right? And so him ordering the withdrawal of the UNEF was the purpose of which was sort of an assertion of his sovereignty and his powers. It was a saving face gesture more than anything else, rather than something that was a prelude to an aggressive war. Just wanted to add that.
He's attempting to show that he can be a credible ally because they had all signed sort of mutual defense. Theoretically, at the time, Syria, there was this entity, the United Arab Republic, that, on paper was comprised of Egypt and Syria. In reality, they both kind of operated as independent.
Right, exactly.
They were kind of theoretically unitary. So you still have to...
I should add, too, what the 1966 invasion was about, something that you see a lot in the current year, too, with respect to how the IDF behaves. But there was it was a collective punishment operation because a couple IDF soldiers got killed, and so they invaded the West Bank and, razed various villages and murdered 3 civilians and wounded 100 or so.
Yeah, that was the Suba incident. That I can't find the name of it right now, but basically 3,000 Israeli troops ended up invading this particular village in the West Bank. The Jordanian army actually intervened, which they weren't expecting. And there's this whole dynamic at the time that kind of continues up to the present day, where the leaders don't really care about Israel. They have bigger fish to fry, but it's very convenient for them to be anti-Israel, but they don't want to actually sacrifice anything on being anti-Israel. And this is fine as long as everybody plays along and does the whole Kfabi, oh yeah, that guy, he's a real son of a bitch, if only I could get my hands on him. But if you actually invade Jordan, then the king of Jordan is put in a very difficult position where he's he can't do nothing because of any credibility he might have. So he has to do some sort of something. So he sends in the army. They I think they chase the Israeli raid back over, screaming curses all the way, I'm sure. They lob a few artillery shells over the border and they kind of hope that the whole thing is smoothed over. But they get into a tiff with their putative allies in Egypt and say that Nasser is hiding behind the skirts of the UN peacekeeping force. So, yeah, Egypt really is kind of the dominant partner in all of these relationships just because of its population, its size, its economic base.
And also its history. I wanted to sort of give my take, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about this, but basically all these countries surrounding Israel, including Israel itself, were basically not that long before this part of the Ottoman Empire, and then shortly after that there was a brief period of about 25 years where the British were kind of controlling it after the First World War, but not really. It was sort of just kind of like a strategic location, but they didn't have a huge influence, and the French were sort of in Lebanon. But the thing was basically a carve-out from the Ottoman Empire, and all these sort of countries, quote-unquote, were basically just arbitrary lines drawn, somewhat arbitrary at least, drawn by Europeans. And there's a lot of disunity amongst the people and the leaders, especially because they're vying for sort of prestige and power. And I think they viewed Palestine not so much as sort of a humanitarian thing, but more as like a territory that they may even be able to annex if they were able to knock out Israel. Because the sort of UN resolutions were all over the place, and there was a country called Transjordan which disappeared at some point, and Jordan itself is sort of it was involved in various skirmishes. Now they're at peace with Israel, and then Syria is sort of its own thing. It's a very confused place, and I think Egypt has a much deeper tradition of being Egypt as opposed to Jordan or somebody like that.
Well, it has an ancient tradition of being Egypt, and it has a more recent tradition of being Arab. But yes, as far as Egypt goes, it's definitely was the natural point for the center, the power center of some kind of Arab national idea.
And when you're explicitly, like, Nasser is, I won't say that he's the guy who invented it, but he probably most represented the notion of Arab nationalism.
Yes, no question.
So it's when you have, like, the Israelis sending a brigade to invade a neighboring country, it's like, yeah, well, you might have to increase your provocations if you want to claim that sort of moral authority.
That's exactly right, Hank.
So the the Syrians and the Jordanians believe this guy. Good plan, guys. And they start launching furious artillery barrages. They start mobilizing troops. This doesn't go too well for them for the same reasons. Like, this is the point in time at which the Jordanians get this call that, like, maybe you want to sit this one out, guys. And the king of Jordan at the time is like, I'm sorry, but the die is already cast. We can't do nothing here. So they're launching artillery strikes. They're fortifying their positions. They're seizing positions around Jerusalem. And the Israelis immediately start launching airstrikes. They destroy their pitiful air force of like 34 planes or whatever, again on the ground with minimal casualties. And they start advancing to encircle Jerusalem. This proceeds very rapidly. They do make a much better show of themselves, both in the Golan Heights of Syria and in the West Bank of Jordan. They inflict significantly higher casualties than the Egyptians did, which isn't saying much, but for whatever it's worth. But nonetheless, the Israelis end up advancing fairly deep into the West Bank. On June 7th, there's a rumor that there's going to be a ceasefire. You see this in a lot of wars, that, like, as soon as there's a rumor that there's going to be a ceasefire, everybody tries to, like, make one last big push to grab whatever they can grab. So the defense minister, Moshe Dayan, General Eye Patch, etc., personally leads the troops to grab the old city of Jerusalem. And there's a iconic picture of the first Israeli troops to advance to the Temple Mount. They're all sort of bowed in prayer and reverence. Meanwhile, the Jordanians have given up. They're withdrawing across the West Bank, and eventually the Israelis just sort of mosey on to take all of these historic sites of Bethlehem and Ramallah and everywhere else.
Long coveted by the Zionists.
Oh, yes. We can get into sort of, that in the aftermath, but I mean, the West Bank is kind of a natural, like, you probably don't want to do a huge amount of cross-river operations there, just because it gets logistically infeasible. And there may have been an undercurrent. I haven't read a lot about this, and it's not public, obviously, but there may be an undercurrent of, well, the Jordanians might not necessarily want a lot of the problems associated with the West Bank. So in Syria, meanwhile, again, it's a similar story. The Israelis initially are kind of tempted to slide because, say, the Golan Heights, like, they are talking about basically you have to run straight up this mountain that's separated by a bunch of streams. So there's very little room to maneuver. You have to basically, like, walk straight up. It's very narrow, so your tanks tend to get pinned down. The Syrians have fortified the shit out of it. They've got forts and pillboxes. They've got a bunch of artillery emplacements at the top where they can shoot downhill. But again, like, even for the Arab powers, the Syrian army at the time was notoriously brutal towards its conscripts. It didn't help either that there's this whole dynamic of the Syrian ruling family. Remind me again what the fringe religion is that they have
in Syria.
Alawites?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're
Sufi. Or?
Yeah, the Alawites. Yeah. So there's this whole Alawite Arab dynamic of like all of their drafty conscripts are Arabs, and all of their officers are Alawites and not particularly competent, again, but non-threatening. So through a combination of just being mercilessly pounded from the air and really just wanting to go home and not dying in a bunker, they end up with as well, inflicting, again, some amount of casualties along the way, but giving up this really irreplaceable strategic position. So in all sort of areas, the Israelis end up advancing to their kind of natural barrier. At the end of this plateau in the Golan Heights, at the Jordan River in the West Bank, and at the canal, the Suez Canal, at the end of the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. And on June 10th, there's a ceasefire, and Israel is sort of left with the most crushing victory, really of one of the most crushing victories of any modern war.
Hank, do you remember exactly how they were able to seize the Golan Heights, despite the fact that they were outgunned on paper again? I believe it had something to do with very clever tactics, but I don't remember.
Who says they were outgunned? I mean, outgunned again. They weren't outgunned.
It is relative, yeah. I mean, they had they had anticipated taking casualties and made a evaluation that it was worth it. They did send in a bunch of sappers and a bunch of armored units to try to kill these bunkers. I mean, I think a lot of this in the West Bank and in the Golan Heights was, okay, well, we'll take our best shot at it and see how far we get. And they ended up just rolling over them. But the combination of having pretty decently trained engineers, combat engineering is one of the most difficult jobs that you can have, because imagine trying to okay, I'm going to build a bridge, but meanwhile somebody is shooting at me. Meanwhile, artillery is going off in all directions, and I don't even get the satisfaction of shooting back at these guys. Instead, I have to focus on making sure all these bolts are torqued to spec. It's something that requires a lot of training. Historically, kind of pre 1940 or so, combat engineers and artillery guys were where the really smart people who are doing army careers would go into, because artillery historically required you to be a good judge of terrain and angles and trigonometry.
Yeah,
and engineering is engineering.
It's where Napoleon got his start. He was an artillery specialist, and he was the guy who basically gave Europe the metric system, and it goes on and on from there. But yeah, it's some big brain power stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, having well-trained combat engineers and air superiority versus conscripts who don't want to be there, I think that's, it's kind of an unsatisfying. There's no magic bullet there. It's not really reproducible, because, well, what if I wasn't a complete bastard to all of my soldiers? What if I, put some anti-aircraft guns that were capable of hitting the planes that were attacking my fixed positions?
Well, what I'm curious about, because, as you say, it's difficult to sort of model this, but it was actually modeled pretty damn accurately by the CIA or whoever performed this analysis, because it was the 6-Day War, and apparently, at least according to Robert McNamara, the U.S. intelligence complex had estimated that if Israel struck first, they would win in a week. So that's pretty damn close. Now, how the hell did they estimate that? I mean, there must have been some sort of analysis going on.
Not only Adam did they estimate the victory, they estimated Israel's attack. I mean, they knew that After the ambassador had arrived, it was quoted, Helms interpreted the remarks suggesting that Israel would attack fairly soon and that Israel would probably start a war within a few days, which happened.
Yeah. I mean,
that's just sort of like intelligence, but I'm curious how they sort of wargamed it.
Yeah.
That's what I'm getting at.
I see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing that probably that was mostly relying on the Egyptian analysis, because like there was nothing saying that they had to try to advance into the West Bank and the Golan Heights. Mostly it's like, okay, who's going to win in the Sinai? And I think that ended up being kind of a subjective evaluation of like, okay, well, they're going to get air superiority because the Egyptian Air Force was not great, even had they been sort of not destroyed on the ground. Like, trying to evaluate the combat effectiveness of troops, like how much room there is to maneuver. I don't know, like, I've never kind of looked in depth. If there's any declassified, like, kind of soup to nuts military evaluations that get quantitative with this, I'd love to see them. But yeah, I'm guessing it's kind of, you know, it's not quite as packed as like, well, you know, you do your Hearts of Iron 4, you know, outcomes calculator. But I'm guessing that it's kind of, you know, after you get through the subjective evaluations of combat effectiveness, it ends up looking pretty close to that. Because, I mean, like, 10 days is nothing. Like, 6 days is less than nothing. That's like, that's
well,
almost
the 10-day estimate
fast.
was if they didn't do a first strike. That was the defensive scenario. Yeah. And
like, okay, so it's not a big area, but still, like, tanks break down and, like, trucks break down. Like, things go wrong. There's only a few roads. That's, like, literally almost as fast as you can just, like, do a road trip across that area.
Well, you should point out that unlike the armies of the American armies, the Israelis, while they gained a military victory, they also gained a political victory. Unlike others.
So immediately after the war, like, there's this notion of the mandate of heaven. It's like, okay, like, clearly the Israeli government has the mandate of heaven.
The mandate of the volcano demon.
Exactly. So there's this huge outpouring of religious sentiment, kind of the world over, because all of these holy sites are now, like, under Israeli control. Like, Jews can go and visit, like the Cave of the Patriarchs. They can go pray at the Temple Mount. Like, every Yom Kippur, the prayer, like, ends with next year in Jerusalem, and it's like, okay, well, now you kind of see that for the empty, empty pro forma hope that is. But historically, when it's not available and then it becomes available, that's a very significant moment. So you see a surge in Jews from the U.S. And from Eastern Europe attempting to or successfully emigrating to Israel. You see a rise in religiosity where you have this Baal Teshuva movement, where you have quote-unquote secular Jews that end up kind of quote-unquote converting to religious Judaism. You have a kind of a boost in the Arab term, like Sibya, like social cohesion that implies that your country can do a thing.
Well, and they also had, the more, in continuing with the narrative that, Israel's constantly fighting these defensive war against savage Arabs, et cetera, this also set the stage. Maybe we'll do a future episode on what happened in 1973, but it allowed, from the political front, allowed what happened in 73 to be framed also as a defensive war when, Egypt and Syria
probably has more of a claim to being a defensive war than...
Yeah, a defensive war against... the Jew wages a defensive war against the territories that they had conquered from you.
Right.
But it's a defensive war on the recent 67 acquisitions that they got through conquest.
The notion of, like, a defensive war is, like, it's just built in as like a meaningless statement.
Well, all these concepts of defensive war, a just and good defensive war, as well as this underdog mythology, these are very Americanist things, and it's no coincidence that they're Americanist in the context of who's supporting the Zionist entity and its ambitions of conquest, and it has to appeal on the
notion of
the
like
narrative
the defensive
front.
war doesn't like appear like there's a notion of like, okay, well, this is a just war or an unjust war.
Well, it does appear in the pleb tier mainstream history narratives. It absolutely appears. It appears everywhere.
Yeah.
That's
what
they call it.
It's very facile. It's like people have reasons for doing things. Like they have like, again, like all of these countries basically decided to start a war or like allowed a war to start, however you'd like to frame it. They put themselves in a position where things were heading towards a significant probability of a losing war. Like Israel, likewise, like put themselves in a position where they were going to like go to war. Like people decided to engage with these dynamics. They didn't really attempt to defuse it, like, mutual combat, like we're going to use like a cop speak type thing. Basically, like, let the drunks fight it out. Like, I'm not interested in who started it. Like, it's fairly interesting to see like what the dynamic is, but like who metaphysically was like on the defense is like, these things are so
Well, the metaphysical question is pretty easy to answer because the Arabs are on the defense because the Zionists had invaded their entire region. I mean, that's the whole thing.
Well,
I mean, the whole
invaded in what sense? Like
they colonized, they colonized Palestine, and then they began expanding territories slowly.
Right.
I mean, the natural configuration of this was an enemy distinction. There's an enemy distinction between Israel and Syria and Transjordan and the UAR. I mean, it was already basically a war footing. I mean, more so than the U.S. and the USSR. I mean, these are neighbors. These are direct neighbors.
Yeah, so my current views have like changed significantly from what they historically were, but I can still appreciate a lot of the historical arguments for the existence of the State of Israel kind of divorced from its current manifestation and whether it's presently a positive force in the region or not. But it's like, I also literally don't have a problem with colonialism. So in the abstract, I don't really have a problem with a boatload of European Jews like showing up and buying a bunch of land from illiterate Muslim peasants in greater Palestine and trying to start a country. I don't even really have a problem with them deciding that like, okay, this little patch of land, like we're going to make it just a little bit more cohesive through a variety of measures.
Well, I mean, I have a problem for the obvious reasons as to Western civilization's relationship with the Arab world, etc. But I mean, I guess this is a debate for another time. I was just talking about the political victory, which I should include the fact that when they took these territories and they were able to use them as a bargaining chip to draw concessions from Egypt and Syria. So that among these you had the rejection of the right of return of Palestinians,
right,
so that the ethnic cleansing could continue unabated. I mean, this was Israel won in every respect. They won military. Totally. They won the military victory with minimal expenditure of resources and men, and then they won the political victory, expansion of territory, expansion of political power. In every respect, it was a total victory for the Zionists.
Yeah, and Nasser looked like a buffoon. I mean, he actually resigned, and then the people like started going into the streets and no, we love you.
Yeah, I question how real that whole thing was.
Well, some people who were there said most of it was legit, but I agree there was probably a lot of false postering going on.
Yeah. So I mean, this leads kind of to a lot of the internal, I guess, Israeli myths and hubrises. Like there's this myth of like Israeli invincibility that you see this a lot, like kind of in the National Review crowd. Obviously, it's like, oh yeah, man, the IDF pound for pound, total badasses, might be small, but they punch above their weight. Like, okay, yes and no. It helps a lot to fight Arabs. I think that was I forget which defense or prime minister said that, but he was asked, like, what's the secret to winning wars, General? And he was like, always fight Arabs.
Yeah. Apparently the opposition, though, has gotten a lot better. I mean, especially with Hezbollah.
Yeah,
so
Hezbollah is the
so well.
Yeah, so when they actually end up fighting like a internally cohesive, fairly well-equipped, not completely retarded opposition that actually believes themselves to be fighting for something, then yeah, the story gets a lot less clear. They took very heavy casualties when they were advancing through Lebanon and trying to actually fight that's a story for another day. There's also this myth of kind of the primacy of the triptych of intelligence, air power, and tank power. That, like, these are the kind of cornerstones of Israeli conventional defense policy. That you have, Shin Bet or whatever other intelligence services out there trying to detect first strikes. You strike first, and you use kind of overwhelming air power followed by armored strikes. It's very, like, it's spooky the extent to which, we were talking about third generation warfare. Like, they're really kind of the apotheosis of, like, Wehrmacht doctrine, kind of as it evolves into the jet age at that point.
Well, and there's a historical thread to that. It's not just a coincidence. There are reasons for that, which again later this month we'll be getting into. But I would add to that trio. You gotta include the fifth column in the American media scene as instrumental as for warfighting. But that's, I guess, something that we'll talk about more in the next episode. But I would just say, like, it has endured the idea that this was a purely some kind of defensive war that was fought, when in reality it was pretty straightforward as far as wars go. I mean, this is a war of conquest that Israel exploited an opportunity in Arab relations to strike at the exact right time and consolidate territorial and political gains.